So I'm joined here today by Dr. Ed Septimus. He is a professor of internal medicine at Texas A&M, and he's also part of Emory's COVID-19 medical advisory panel, as well as one for different organizations across the city. So thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Max. Thanks for having me.
So I want to begin with where we are right now in the United States in the pandemic. There were recent data points that came out this week that case numbers and hospitalizations are actually down a little bit. But at the same time, there have been reports across the country from medical health officials and people specializing in public health that we need to continue wearing masks and following the protocols. Where would you say we are right now, and why are continuing those mechanisms so important?
Sure. Well, I think you're right. The numbers across the United States for the last week or so have finally shown a very nice downward trend. There are still a few hot spots across the United States, but Houston is very typical of what's going on across the country. In the last 10 to 14 days, we've seen a significant drop in hospitalizations. Our positivity rates have gone down. So it looks like, whether or not you want to call this the second wave or the third wave, it looks like we're beginning to, if you would, bend the curve in the right direction. The next question you ask is an excellent question. We see people being vaccinated. We see rates in our community decrease. But let's be clear, there's still transmission going on in most communities across the United States. We've not been able to immunize a significant number of people in part due to vaccine supply. And so transmission is still occurring. Masks are one of the most effective ways in which we can prevent transmission from person to person, along with social distancing. And so until such time as we have what we call herd immunity, where the virus numbers are extremely low in our community, we're going to be continuing to social distance. We're going to continue to be wearing masks when we cannot social distance. And I want to emphasize to the people who may be viewing this that being outside does not give you a pass. Because some people think, well, if we're outside, we don't need to worry about it. But if you can't social distance outside, you also need to be wearing a mask. So for the foreseeable future, I know COVID fatigue is setting in for a lot of people. But for the foreseeable future, even though rates are clearly getting better, I really feel finally we see our rates in hospitalizations decline. This is no time to let up on the basics of social distancing, wearing masks, and washing our hands. All very, very important to try to control this pandemic.
So you mentioned there about that we're in either second or third wave, and also the reduction of cases. But this also comes at a time that we have new strains circulating around the country, at least new more concerning strains, namely the South African, UK, and Brazilian strains. Those have all been in the US. I believe only the UK has officially been confirmed in Texas. What are your fears about those strains specifically, potentially leading to another spike? And could one of those become our dominant strain soon?
Again, great questions. You've done your homework. So mutation or variants in these viruses, just to let you know, is common. This is an RNA virus. Influenza is an RNA virus. And many of you know that we change the composition of the vaccine every year. So some variants are expected. Now, the variants that we're seeing now from the UK, that variant may be a little bit more contagious than the variant that was there before. It probably doesn't cause any more severe disease. And on the upside, the current vaccines that are available seem to work pretty well against the UK variant as it does the other variant that was in the United States before. And the UK variant is becoming more and more common throughout the United States. The one that we worry a little bit more about is the South African Brazilian variant. It is also more contagious, may not be as responsive to the current vaccines that are out there. It's been found isolated in 3 states in the United States. And as you mentioned, it's not in Texas. Whether or not that'll become a predominant strain in the United States over time, it's hard to predict. But I think we can be sure that the UK strain is becoming more and more common throughout the United States. It's certainly in over 30 states, and the CDC projects it may become potentially the predominant strain in the US. Just don't know quite yet about the South African strain.
So you mentioned briefly that it's an RNA virus, and that's a good transition to the type of vaccines, at least the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, which are mRNA vaccines. And there's been, at least I've done a lot of reading about mRNA vaccines, and it seems as though some of the fears that people have with long-term health effects with normal vaccines might be different. Can you explain maybe how an mRNA vaccine works, and to the people who are hesitant about vaccines, the risk? Because this is pretty much the first widespread mRNA vaccine, at least that I've heard of.
Well, first, the technology to make these vaccines is not brand new. These vaccines were being developed actually for vaccines for Ebola and other emerging pathogens. But once the pandemic hit and once we knew the genomic sequencing of the virus, Moderna and Pfizer and others began re-engineering their technology to make vaccines effective against the COVID-19 virus. But this is a brilliant technology, and what it is basically the very small amount of genetic material that codes for the spike protein on the virus. Everybody's seen pictures with the spikes outside. It's the spikes that actually adhere to a receptor in multiple organs in the body. And so the whole idea is if we can make this RNA to produce a spike protein that we can respond to and make antibodies. So that's what we have. We have this little bit of protein or RNA that is coding for the spike protein. Once it's injected into our muscle, that bit of genetic material then codes for the spike protein. Once they make the spike protein, our body responds to that by making antibodies to the spike protein. Once that occurs, the antibodies neutralize the spike protein, so the spike protein can't bind to essential organs like the lung as an example, thereby protecting us from getting infected. So it's a really brilliant technology to do that. The other vaccines, which people have heard about, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine, are similar in that they also code for this spike protein, but they do it a little differently. It's sort of a vector borne. And what that means is it kind of goes along with another virus. In this case, it's a virus that does not hurt us. It's an adenovirus. It gets into the muscle, again, codes for the spike protein, and our body reacts by making antibodies. So a little bit different, but similar ideas about how we can stimulate our body to make antibodies that protect us from getting infected with this particular virus.
Can you talk about the safety of these vaccines, any potential long-term health effects, and the rigorous protocols that they've had to go through to get the FDA authorization?
Well, the protocol is pretty rigorous. There were no shortcuts, I can tell you, in how this vaccine was evaluated by the FDA. And the vaccine trials were done as per protocol. Now, it's gotten something called emergency authorization, meaning it looks like it's safe and effective, but obviously, only tens of thousands of people were in these vaccine trials. And we wait 2 months after the vaccine trial is finished to see whether or not there are any unanticipated side effects from the vaccine. So the majority of people who get serious side effects from the vaccine do so within 2 months. Now, as in any vaccine or drug, because it only is tested in a limited number of people, when we start getting millions of doses, sometimes we see a side effect we may not have seen with the original trial. We haven't seen that. Now, the vaccine does have some side effects. Now, understanding the side effects are in response to what appears to be an infection with the spike protein. And so you're going to get some fevers, you're going to get some muscle aches, you may feel chilly and achy, just like you're getting an actual infection. Those are fairly short-lived. It's more common because the Moderna and the Pfizer are 2 doses. It's more common after you get the second dose, but it's very manageable. And those, you probably heard on the news, those rare people who might have gotten a more severe, quote, anaphylactic reaction, unquote, from the vaccine, That has not been commonly reported. It was seen in the beginning, very, very uncommon. It's probably a component to the vaccine. It may be the propylene glycol in the vaccine, but those have not been very common and none of them have been life-threatening. So as far as we know up to now, you will get some side effects. And in 25, 50% will get some side effect, especially after the second dose. There doesn't appear to be any unexpected side effects. And long term, because remember, this is just a little bit of genetic material that codes for the spike protein. It doesn't get into our DNA or any of those other theories that some people have mentioned. We're not anticipating there's going to be any long-term negative after effects, but I can tell you a few side effects from a vaccine is a whole lot better than getting a life-threatening illness from a patient who has COVID. Remember, we've had over 450,000 people die in the United States due to this pandemic. And we know that from Israel, as an example, where they've been able to immunize a significant percentage of the population, they've now seen a 30 to 40% drop in deaths in the people who've been immunized with the vaccine. So that's the thing that people need to keep in mind. What the end game is, the end game is to prevent severe disease, to prevent deaths, decrease transmission rate, so we can begin to learn to live with this virus. And so we don't have to do all the measures that were currently in place. That does not mean we may not be still wearing masks for a while, et cetera, but at least get back to some more normal life as opposed to what we've been experiencing the last 8 to 9 months.
So we've talked about these vaccines a bit, and when I was talking with people, I had some requests from different students and teachers to talk about some of the alternative treatments that they've heard about on the news, namely hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. There have been reports both that claim that it's been helpful and claim that it has had no effect. Can you touch on those alternative treatments?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the easier questions you've asked me, Max. I think it's been shown now over and over again, despite some initial enthusiasm for some French investigators early on in the pandemic, hydroxychloroquine in well done controlled studies has not been shown to be of any benefit. Unfortunately, I mean, we really wish that it had. Ivermectin's been the newest kid on the block with, again, not well-controlled studies showing some patients may have benefited. They don't seem to progress. But Merck, who is the manufacturer of ivermectin, put out a statement today, or actually maybe a couple of days ago, saying it doesn't work, don't use it in their own clinical trials. So I think coming from the manufacturer, who obviously wants to sell drug, when they say it doesn't work, and a very good pharmaceutical company like Merck, I think we can say that ivermectin, unless new data becomes available, and certainly hydroxychloroquine, which has been now studied extensively, they're not, unfortunately, treatments for this disease.
So I want to shift now towards Emory, which is the school that I attend and that you've advised our medical panel on, and talk about some of the protocols you've put in place. You know, the hallways, social distancing, mask wearing, a modified schedule, and even the protocols we have during lunch. Can you explain to our students why you picked those specific protocols? And we've had no transmissibility, so why they've been so effective as well.
Well, first of all, I work with a great group of other physicians that I want to call out. You know, Dr. Akai Fields, Dr. Patty Savage, and Dr. Eric Haas are the other physicians on the medical advisory, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't say that it's been a pleasure working with all of them. But early on, we looked at the science, and that's what's driven us. Now, of course, when we opened school back in September, our rates in the community were a lot lower than they've been recently, but there were some basic things that we knew. Number one, as I already mentioned, masks cut down on transmission. We knew that this virus primarily was transmitted by close contact, and we define close contact as being within 6 feet for at least 15 minutes with someone who is not masked, okay? We knew that ventilation was very important. And so if you're in a crowded, poorly ventilated space, the virus, especially if you're not wearing masks, like in bars and other places, transmission rate is going to be a lot higher. And so when we designed opening school, we did a couple of things. First of all, we asked the school to improve their ventilation system, which they did. I mean, it was a nice investment that they made. We wanted to enforce mask wear, and we wanted to make sure that we could separate the students uh, uh, in their desks. And obviously, masks were going to be a critical part of the equation. We wanted to make sure that we could disinfect, that is, clean the surfaces that are frequently touched. And we did that again by, by empowering others to do this on a regular basis throughout the school day. Now, more recently, as you know, we did have sort of a staggered schedule where a couple of grades came in the morning time, and then a couple of grades came in the evening time, or I guess it was middle school and high school. We've now, because we've gotten enough experience and we know that these protocols work, if you wash your hands, okay. By the way, we also tell people don't come to school if you're ill. So you got to wash your hands. You got to go through a check of symptoms. Make sure you're not having any fever. Wash your hands. Social distance. Wear masks. Have good ventilation. All of that was in place. The Emory Weiner staff did a phenomenal job of executing what we call all these mitigation strategies. We now know through multiple studies that in fact transmission in schools is very uncommon if you have the safety features in place, which Emory Weiner does. So we felt comfortable that when we opened the school year after the winter break, that perhaps we'd go back to a more normal schedule. As you know, people were not eating on campus. And so we had to say, okay, how could we do that safely? Because you can't eat with your masks on. And so we try to use the large spaces and the outdoor spaces as much as we can, make sure people stayed socially distanced while they were eating. And we've been able to do that. And the student body has been very cooperative while they've been on campus. And so we've been able to safely open school on a more normal schedule after the experience we gained in the fall with all the mitigation strategies we had in place.
Yeah, and thus far we've had 0 cases transmitted on campus, which is incredible. I want to transition to some of the kids who are still home, who might be worried about a family member, who are just not comfortable on campus. And the studies that have come out that have said that there have been major mental health problems for students at home, both all across the country, really. And also they've had a worse education experience. Do you have any expertise to touch on about some of those mental health or educational problems and not having schools open if the CDC has actually started to recommend?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear that distance learning is challenging for many students. There are some with the right support and the right environment at home may have a reasonable experience. But as you know, part of the school experience is working with others, the interactions with teachers and classmates. And so all this is important in not only the academic maturity, but also the maturity of an individual as a person. So those are very important, and you lose that when you don't have in person. The second thing that's become clear, and this is tragically true, and you hit right on it, mental illness and depression are actually higher in teenagers than they are in adults because of the social distancing that's occurred. And in some communities, the rate of suicide in this age group is higher than the deaths due to COVID. And to me, that says it all, that if we can open schools safely with the right safety features in place, that we have an opportunity here to not only improve the learning of our students, but also the safety and their mental well-being needs to be taken into the equation. So if we can open safely, we're not going to have transmission on campus. There are non-COVID related illnesses that are suffering, not just among the ages in Emory Weiner, but across all ages, people not getting routine visits for chronic disease, coming in later in their disease and being much sicker. Cancers not being detected. I can go on and on. Immunization rates, including immunization rates in teenagers, falling behind because for a while it was difficult to see their own physician because of social distancing. So lots of things we have to weigh in this pandemic. But I think one of the bright spots is I think we've learned how to open schools safely.
You talked about some of the school events and the importance of being in person, and a lot of my fellow seniors have been asking our administration constantly about prom and the possibility that that could happen. Do you think that that's even theoretically possible? And if so, what protocols would have to be in place?
Yeah, I mean, the prom, I guess, is later in the year. I think it would be too early to give it a yes or a no. Again, one of the ways, in fact, the predominant way in which the virus is now being transmitted in our communities through small and larger gatherings. It's not in school that we already just mentioned. So especially if it was going to be held next month, or later this month, I would be very reluctant to say you should have a large gathering like a prom when we know that transmission rates in our community are still elevated. So I think we have to play it month by month. But my guess is that anything that involves gatherings like that, at least for the foreseeable future, and I'll just say the next 1 to 2 months, probably is not safe.
And what do you think about in June? Because I think theoretically it would happen in June. Do you think there's any possibility by June?
I haven't got a crystal ball. There's a number of variables, immunization rates among adults. We may even have data out that high schoolers may safely be able to take the vaccine. There are ongoing trials that are occurring now. That would be a variable. What happens to the variant that we talked about earlier? Is the South African variant, for instance, going to take hold in a community like Houston? All of that would change the equation about how safe things are when it comes to June. So I wouldn't really want to commit to anything. I really have learned a long time ago in my career, especially with new and emerging infectious diseases, don't get ahead of the science. Let's sort of do it step by step. Let's not overpromise and underdeliver. I try to be a realist, but also to tell people that we are going to get through this. I mean, Emory Wiener is an example that you can open safely. And at least school, I know it doesn't look and feel exactly the same, but it's better than having remote learning for the entire year. So we've learned how to adapt, and we just have to do things step by step, following the science and not get too far ahead of ourselves.
You just mentioned the 12 to 15-year-olds, the younger students, and the trials that are going on with them for the vaccine. Right now, at least for the Pfizer, 16 to 18-year-olds can get it. What needs to happen for those 12 to 15-year-olds to get past? Are there extra standards that children in that age have to go through for it to get approved?
Well, they're actively recruiting right now. In fact, Moderna is in Houston actively recruiting to see whether or not people under age 18, because Moderna is 18 and Pfizer 16, can safely take the vaccine. When the results of those trials are over, we hopefully might have an addendum to the FDA to amend who can safely receive the vaccine. I don't know how fast that's going to occur. It may happen faster than we think because they're actively doing it now. But remember, you have to wait at least 2 months from the time the trial may be complete before they might even consider making a revision to the FDA. So I'm not anticipating we're going to see anything before March or April, but by May, we may have information that we didn't have before that may lower the age of people who can be safely vaccinated. And hopefully we're going to have 1 or 2 more vaccines out there so that vaccine supply will be at the point where I'm hoping by May that anybody who wants the vaccine can get the vaccine, at least above a certain age.
And then my last question for you is one that I've gotten from a lot of people, which is, at what point will we actually be able to take off the masks? Is that it herd immunity when we're at 75% or more vaccinated? Is it later on? There have been reports that it could be an endemic, meaning it's a yearly thing. So what's the mark at which the mask could finally come off?
That's a great question. Also, as I mentioned, I'm going to go back to the number of variables we just talked about. The other thing is a little frustrating that you probably know, there are some people who say they are not going to take the vaccine. In the US, it's about 1 in 4 say they won't take the vaccine. In Europe, it's as high as 50%, to give you an example. It's going to be very difficult to achieve herd immunity with the current vaccines we have if only half of the population take the vaccine. So that's one concern. Second concern that I can't predict is what mutant's going to be the predominant mutant. If it's the UK mutant, the vaccines are going to be pretty good. Okay, but I think you mentioned something else. I believe it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that this is going to go from a pandemic to being endemic, just like influenza is every year. The question is going to come at some point. We still want to protect our elderly and our most vulnerable. We hope the vaccines, even if they don't prevent all infection, will prevent the severe infections and the ones that lead to hospitalization and deaths. When we're going to get to that point where we have 70 to 80% herd immunity is unclear because, again, some reluctance to take the vaccine. How low do the rates have to be for us to say, hey, I can go to a concert, I can go to a baseball game, or when we get into those situations, are we going to have to take a test to show that we're negative before we get into that event? Is testing going to become that widespread? And is that going to allow us to finally remove masks? These are variables and questions that I am not here to tell you that I know the answer. I can only tell you for the foreseeable future, expect to continue to wear masks, continue to do social distancing, continue to wash your hands. You probably heard the statement, the 3 W's: wash your hands, watch your distance, wear a mask. I think all of those are going to be in place at least for the next 2 or 3 months. And we're just going to have to see how the variants occur, what the acceptance rates for vaccines are, what the community levels of transmission will be. Will this become seasonal? Will it be more like influenza, where hopefully over the summer, unlike last summer, we'll see rates come down extremely low and then maybe come back in the fall? These are things we don't know. It's a brand new virus, like no other virus. I've been at this over 40 years. There's never been a virus like this in my 40 years. And clearly, as a pandemic, it's the first pandemic that looks like what happened in 1918. The other thing that I'll also just say in closing is we need better drugs to treat the infection of patients who have it. Right now, you mentioned hydroxychloroquine, flamed out, didn't work, okay? You've heard of probably remdesivir. Well, remdesivir has some activity, but as it's been better studied, it only works in a very small segment of people who get hospitalized, not the really sick ones, unfortunately. So we need better therapeutics for patients who get sick enough to be hospitalized. Another one I know that you thought about is the use of monoclonals. And where monoclonals seem to work best is those high-risk people who have early COVID symptoms. They're being offered monoclonals as an outpatient, a 1-hour infusion. And the initial data looks very promising that the majority of these people do not progress and do not need to be hospitalized. Of course, these are patients that have not been immunized yet. But there's a group of people who may have their immune system really knocked down, an MD Anderson cancer patient that may not respond as well to the vaccine. So there still may be a role for monoclonals moving forward. But again, our therapeutics are better than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. Our mortality rates have declined, but by no means do we have the therapeutics we need when someone gets sick to fight this infection. It's not like giving penicillin to someone who has a strep infection. We don't have that really, really good drug to fight this infection. So research is ongoing. So that's the other bit of the puzzle that I don't know yet. Variants, effectiveness of vaccine, and whether or not we have better therapeutics to really treat infections in patients who get ill enough to be hospitalized. Those are all variables for the future. I hope all of those are going to get better over time. But again, just caution everybody, don't take your foot off the pedal yet. Rates are coming down in Houston, but there's still community transmission. We've got to continue to do the things we've been doing. I know it's tough.
Yeah, wearing masks, washing hands, and social distancing, also important. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Septimus.
Thank you. Excellent interview and good luck to you.